Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. Tonight, a frantic search for a 10-year-old girl after she vanishes just minutes from her home.
Holly, honey, our hearts are out to you. Baby, if you can hear me, you know how much we love you. I feel you inside of me, and I'm trying to find you. I'm doing everything. Everybody's working very hard. And whoever has her, I beg you with all my heart that you keep her and bring her home to her mother and father. You keep her safe, I beg you. She hasn't ever hurted anyone in her life. She's a happy girl. I beg you not to hurt her.
Here now is In Broad Daylight, the abduction of Holly Jones.
They spent the evening playing, and it was really good until she had to go home. Holly kept insisting to me that, "It's okay, Mom. I told her mother that I will walk her home." And I said, "You're not allowed to walk her home. You know you're not allowed to walk the streets on your own." And she said, "But Mom, I promised to walk her home. I go that way to school every day. I can do that." And I looked at her and I thought, she looks so independent that I didn't want to take this away from her. I'm gonna let her this one time. And I said, "Okay, but as long as you come straight back."
So this was the first time that Holly, who was a street-proof 10-year-old child, was allowed to walk alone with her friend to her home, which was a short 20-minute walk away.
I was upstairs, and I think I heard her going for a walk with her friend that day, so I kind of felt bad that I should have walked with her.
And then she left. I remember her walking out the door so clearly, as if it was last week, actually.
Holly had walked to the Arroyo home with her schoolmate, Claudia, Teresa's 9-year-old daughter.
She was a pretty nice girl, very outgoing.
Her friend's mother actually offered to take Holly home, to walk her back home. But Holly had reassured her friend's mother that she was fine, she knew her way. And that woman sadly watched Holly walk until she disappeared out of sight.
I assumed she stopped and forgot about the time, played with her friends for a while. I got upset with her, and then I got back, and she wasn't home. Straight away I asked my son, James, "Have you seen Holly?" And he said no, and immediately I had this ache in my stomach. I started panicking, and I quickly phoned my husband. He was across the street, and hoped that she was with him. And he said no, he hasn't seen her at all. I knew there was something wrong.
Maria called me and asked me if Holly was at my house. I knew that right away. I thought something's really wrong. Got in my car and went up to her house.
As time went on, then it got later and later. Holly wasn't coming home, and it became more scary.
And I called the police, but they were saying that it was a bit too early for the call, that she hasn't been missing long enough. But I insisted that we need to look for her now, that she's in danger.
There was a command post established. The parents, the neighbors, the neighborhood were all assisting, searching and looking for Holly. I think all of us knew that night, when Holly wasn't found in the early hours of the search, that she was in trouble.
By the time it got dark, I knew it was bad.
Nobody could find her, nobody knew where she went. And so the kids mobilized themselves to try to do community searches, and things quickly moved into making posters and trying to get things happening to try to find her.
We're looking for my sister right now, Holly Jones. She has blonde hair, brown eyes, 10 years old. She's been missing since 7 o'clock last night in the Perth area, and right now we're looking for her. It's been 12 hours, and we're trying our best.
10-year-old Holly is 5 feet tall, weighs 92 pounds. She was wearing a green and blue bomber-style rain jacket, purple sweater, brown pants, and brown leather boots. A province-wide Amber Alert is now in effect, with dozens of officers from all divisions, including Marine, Mounted, and Canine, joining in the search.
Being the first Amber Alert issued in Ontario meant that every news outlet, every billboard on the highway, anybody that's listening to a radio would know that we're looking for this little girl, and all eyes would be watching for her.
But it wasn't until 10:40 this morning, more than 16 hours later, an Amber Alert was called.
White female, 5 feet tall.
It was the Amber Alert's first real test in Canada.
There was some pushback because it didn't quite fit the mandate of the Amber Alert back then. In other words, you needed evidence. Somebody had to see the child being abducted or have some other evidence that she was abducted.
Bring her home to us. Please.
Come home, Holly, please. This is Holly.
You know her. Oh, happy she's always happy. She's never sad. Don't make her sad.
Thank you.
I was hoping that if I asked for her back, that whoever has her would give me her back.
The father of missing 10-year-old Holly Jones left the family's West End home this afternoon, escorted by homicide detectives. Moments later, Holly's mother, Maria, along with her son, were also taken to police headquarters.
I think they want to treat everyone as a person of interest. I mean, it was bothersome to be kind of like interrogated that you could have possibly did the crime, but I also respected the job of the police.
Over 100 officers canvassed a large area around the neighborhood where Holly went missing, going door to door, searching inside and outside private properties and businesses.
Our belief was that she was likely abducted for a sexual purpose, and history has told us that when that happens, you have minutes to hours to get the child back alive.
Coming up, human remains are found floating in the lake. Ten-year-old Holly Jones went missing after walking a friend home. She disappeared only blocks from her Toronto home. Here now is In Broad Daylight, the abduction of Holly Jones.
Down there on the shore of Ward's Island, just south of downtown, you can see investigators putting more covering over the human remains found this morning. Police say the Marine unit found the body parts wrapped in plastic floating in Lake Ontario near the island. And although the remains are reportedly those of a child, so far police say they don't know if this grisly discovery is related to the disappearance of Holly Jones.
I arrived in the homicide squad offices first thing in the morning, and Inspector Brian Rabel called me aside and he said, Al, he said, I need you to get over to Ward's Island immediately.
When I heard that there had been a torso found floating in Toronto Harbor, I had conflicting information. You know, it's a child, it's an adult, it's a man, it's a woman. So it was very confusing. So it wasn't until I got a call from my partner, Al Como, that I started to understand what we were up against. That it was likely the torso of a small child, a girl, and probably in the age of around Holly Jones. So everybody was put on high alert.
I immediately requested a land, air, and water search be conducted to try and find the other missing body parts.
This exclusive underwater video shows what the divers see as they search for clothes, objects, even body parts.
Around mid-afternoon, I got a call that searchers had found another bag floating in Toronto Harbor.
And Dave Perry headed over to be able to make the identification of Holly.
None of the officers on the boat were even talking. And they pulled this bag off and it was dripping blood and water. So we took the bag in and we asked if we could start examining it. I had a picture of Holly. I still have that picture today. and Dr. Gilmore put on some very long shoulder-length rubber gloves and reached into the bag, and he told us that he felt body parts. And I was standing beside him with a picture, and I identified 100% that that was Holly Jones. Probably the most surreal moment in my entire life was that moment in the morgue. So there was no talking. I think we just stood in silence.
Just 24 hours after she disappeared, homicide detectives made this grim announcement.
The search for Holly Jones is now a search for a killer.
While detectives spoke to the media, the girl's parents were told the awful news at police headquarters.
It felt very strange because the police picked us up in our unmarked car and started taking us down to the headquarters. It didn't set in until like we were upstairs, and then we're in the room.
George, he knew right away. He took one look at us and he just collapsed in his chair with his head between his legs. He knew what was coming.
I remember feeling extremely frustrated because I thought, why aren't you out on the streets looking for Holly?
They looked at my mom and dad and said sorry, and she started crying. That's when
Maria screamed, yelled, jumped up, and was angry. Like, what did you just tell me? What did you just say?
And all I kept thinking immediately was she raped? And I grabbed the detective, he wouldn't answer me, and I grabbed him and shook him, and I said, I was screaming, you have to tell me, was she raped? He nodded his head and said, yes. I went from James to George back and forth, wanting to comfort them, trying to take this pain away, but it was there. It was horrible. It was just horrific.
It was a tough night, and for the first time in my life, I'm afraid to close my eyes. And I woke up screaming with night terrors. But all that did was piss me off. I got up so angry at what this guy had done to this poor little girl. I'd never been so motivated in my entire life to catch somebody, and that's what fueled me.
This is a black bag. It was newer in condition when it was found. Also, we have the carry-on, the Cherokee bag here, the airplane carry-on. Seems to be in fairly new condition. And found in the bag, we also had the dumbbell, presumably to weight the bag down.
The head of the homicide squad hopes someone will recognize these two bags, which contained Holly Jones' remains.
We're basically one phone call away from apprehending this monster.
They didn't have any clue who did it. So my parents and I and my sisters, we were living on the edge because we didn't know who did it. It could be one of our neighbors, it could be anyone at this point.
So when Dave and I were developing the investigation strategy, one of the things we did was we went over to a local department store, and it was within 2 to 3 minutes walk of the last route that Holly had walked on. And while we were over there, we found you could stand in one location and reach out and actually, have items that you could purchase that the killer purchased that were found inside the black suitcase with Holly's, body parts. So it was clear that there was a good possibility the killer lived in that neighborhood and had obtained all the items that we were, looking at for evidence from that store.
So the day after we recovered Holly, we wanted to walk the route that she had walked. She came from her friend's place just a couple of blocks north of where we are now. And Al Coleman and I stood right here, and looked down this laneway and thought, what a perfect place. What an absolutely perfect place to grab a child.
There was a home on our right-hand side. It was a 3-story rooming house, and the windows were covered up.
We thought if abduction was going to happen, that would be a perfect place to get a child off the streets really quickly.
He could have been in that door in 10 seconds with her, and it just gave us chills.
And then we moved on, not knowing that we'd be coming back to that house. The two startling discoveries at the Center of Forensic Sciences, the big one was obtaining the fingernail clippings from Holly's hands, because as a homicide investigator, we always pray that the victim fights back against their attacker and scratches them and obtains a suspect DNA profile. So the fingernail clippings were obtained that later tested, with a suspect DNA profile. And the other huge discovery was I was present for the laser examination of Holly's torso, and the laser, lit up 4 to 5 green fibers. They were polypropylene and commonly found in inexpensive green bath mats and green carpeting. So that was a huge clue for us to be able to use when the investigation's canvas started, and we could direct detectives to look for those specific items.
So right from the get-go, we had hundreds of people that had to be investigated.
Coming up, startling news surfaces about sex offenders living in Holly's neighborhood. Investigators have an unknown DNA sample taken from Holly Jones's fingernails, and a number of green fibers also found on her body. But so far, no suspect. We return to In Broad Daylight, the abduction of Holly Jones.
I just easily had a good time with Holly. She was always in for singing and dancing. We did a lot of singing and dancing together.
One birthday party or so, my mom and dad rented a karaoke machine and we were having a good time. I remember her dressing up as like a rock star for Halloween.
She had a guitar around her and the glasses and the whole rock star costume. The hair was punked up as we went from door to door trick-or-treating. She really was a big hit. I remember that last weekend that we were together very clearly. Friday we had a fire outside in our back, and most of the evening was just Holly and me, and I was teaching her how to roast marshmallows. And actually we discovered that evening that the both of us don't like to eat them, we like to just roast them.
The wooden casket carrying the remains of Holly Jones made its way into St. Vincent de Paul, the same Catholic church where she was baptized almost 11 years ago. Holly's grieving parents, Maria Jones and George Stonehouse, followed, along with sisters Natasha and Shauna and brother Jamie.
I caught myself looking up into the sky all the time, as if she could see me.
Far across the distance and spaces between us, you have come to show you.
It was really one of those unforgettable moments. It was broadcast live. Everybody I knew was tuned in to watching that funeral, and it was heartbreaking.
The effect that it had on myself, on Dave, on the others in the task force was that it strengthened everyone's resolve to, work even harder to catch Holly's killer before he had the chance to do it again.
In an effort to catch the killer of Holly Jones, police have now released computerized photographs of what they believe the 10-year-old was wearing the Monday night she went missing in her Bloor and Dundas neighborhood.
We had non-stop 911 calls about a suspicious person trying to abduct a child. We had multiple theories Lots of information coming in. There were so many people that you could look at and believe that they could be responsible for the murder.
Anxiety is high in the West End community where Holly Jones was abducted because there is still no suspect in her slaying, and people now are aware that there are more than 200 known sex offenders living in the area of Bloor West and Dundas Street.
I was totally shocked, and certainly the city was as well. It was unbelievable that there could be that many in one area of the city.
Police plan to speak with every resident in the neighborhood and in some cases take DNA samples. This man voluntarily gave a DNA sample.
Yeah, well, they did ask me about if I would be willing to do the swab, and they explained my rights and such, that I don't have to do this, and they didn't threaten in any way if I didn't do it, so I had no problem in doing it.
The consent was in writing, and it gave residents the assurance that their DNA sample would be destroyed and not retained after the investigation.
The reaction that we got from 99% of the people in that neighborhood was, overwhelming support, and so they were willing to do anything to help the police solve the case.
We had some pushback on randomly asking people for consent DNA. Civil rights lawyers were commenting about it.
All I can tell you is it really makes no difference to us whether somebody provides a sample voluntarily or whether they don't. They're all possible suspects, and it's all a matter of a process of elimination.
The big job now is to analyze all the DNA samples they've collected and to catalog them.
Prioritizing those DNA samples for the Center for Forensic Science and having them eliminated shrinks it down to a pretty small pool. And within weeks of our investigation, that's what we had.
We went from 468 persons of interest initially. We reduced that number to 19, then to the final 3, and then to the person who murdered Holly Jones. One we called the Bleach Man.
Bleach Man stood out because he had a prior conviction for a similar offense, molestation of a girl Holly's age.
He lived 2 miles away from where Holly lived, but he had a car and he was mobile. When the detectives arrived at the apartment building, as soon as he opened the door, the detectives smelled like an overpowering smell of bleach.
The overwhelming smell of bleach is a sign that it was a crime scene that was being cleaned up.
So they asked for a consent sample of his DNA, and he refused and slammed the door. I needed to get a surveillance team on him to obtain an abandoned sample, which I did immediately.
And they obtained his DNA sample and it was cleared.
The second other person of interest was a man who lived directly across the street from where Holly lived, and he was sleeping in a woodworking shop.
This person of interest was called Workshop Man.
They also had tools that would be similar to what we know was used to dismember Holly's body, so very, very high up on the list.
This male came to our attention because, we knew that he knew Holly. He'd have an opportunity to see her coming and going from her house. We eventually got an abandoned DNA sample from him, and it was tested, and he was ruled out as having been the killer. So when the detectives we assigned to do the investigation canvass arrived at 1450 Bloor Street West and met with Michael Briere, there were a number of items that shone a spotlight on him.
He was ringing all the bells in terms of somebody that potentially could have done it.
What made police so suspicious? That's after the break. After weeks of canvassing the neighborhood from where Holly Jones was abducted, police have narrowed in on local resident Michael Briere. We return to In Broad Daylight, the abduction of Holly Jones.
Well, there were several things about Michael Briere that made him a person of interest.
Briere lived alone. He had no alibi for the night that Holly was murdered. He claimed to have been at home, working on his computer. He had dumbbells, near his bed as well as in a closet. And we had a dumbbell, one dumbbell, from a set that was inside the Cherokee brand suitcase with Holly's head and arms that had been used in an attempt to sink it. One of the most important details was, there were 2 green bath mats in the bathroom. The detectives during that visit asked Michael Briere, "How do you clean your floors?" And his response was, "I don't use a mop."
The police officers know the killer has dumped the mop and these cleaning supplies with the body, and he has a pail with no mop in it. So he's already thinking 2 steps ahead.
Briere refused to provide a consent DNA sample. As well, he had children's toys that were on the mantelpiece in his living room, and he told us that children don't come to visit, and he didn't have any children of his own. So we decided it was time for a special visit to Michael Briere to determine what additional investigation needed to be done.
I'll never forget, it was really hot, and we were standing on Bloor Street, rush hour traffic, no answer at the door, and this guy walks by us like we're invisible. And I remember Al and I reaching out and he said, whoa, where are you going? Who are you? And he says his name's Michael Briere. And I said, well, you're just the guy we're here to talk to.
So a huge item that we saw when we went into the home was there were no more green bath mats.
And Al and I and the other officers all noticed that they were gone. They were no longer there. And there was actually a brand new package of shower curtains and bath mats sitting on his kitchen table.
And we knew from the evidence that, the green bath mats had been there when the detectives first visited Briere as part of the investigation canvas. Michael Briere reacted differently each time he was asked for a DNA consent sample. That Big Brother is watching us. When Dave and I visited Briere at his home, he came out with another response that included there's too much government control.
He got very angry. He got in my face. Like, he was so angry I thought he was going to take a swing at me. And I told him to calm down and back off, and he did. And his moods would spike, like from normal, calm, cooperative to angry, almost to the point of being violent with you.
The end of the visit, I'd said to Michael Briere, I said, if we have any other questions, is it okay if we meet again and speak with you?
I said, well, how would you like to come in for an interview? And he said, of course, yeah, sure, guys, I'll come in and have an interview. After a fairly lengthy interview, where he said some really interesting things, including the reason he wouldn't give us a DNA sample, and he interrupted me and he said, well, I'm pretty sure that the science works when they compare samples, and that's what scares me. And he chuckled. So when we focused in on the changes that he made in the bathroom, he said that he had green shower curtains and that he had changed those. So I asked him, I said, did you change anything else? Well, yes, I changed the little mats.
So Dave asked Briere in that video interview, what were the color of the bath mats that you had in your home? And Briere looks right at us and he said, black.
And I said, so what color was the previous bath mat that you had? And he went, black.
Would a normal person who had nothing to do with Holly's murder lie about something like the color of the bath mats that they had in their home? Not likely. And we knew from our visit that he now had beige bath mats in there. So it very likely was an attempt to destroy evidence and conceal, what he'd done.
So yeah, when he walked out of that interview, we started feeling some things that we might be onto something here. We had surveillance on him almost around the clock. He never left one single cast-off DNA sample in all the time that we were following him.
Eventually, we were able to get an abandoned sample, and that was after the video interview that Dave and I did with Briere at 12 Division.
We let our surveillance teams know he was coming out, and within minutes we got a call back that he had bought himself a can of Pepsi, drank it on the way to the subway station, and threw the can in the garbage, and of course they recovered that can. Unfortunately, when they went to get it, there was only 2 things in there, which were 2 Pepsi cans. Tested both of them. One of them came up as a match to our DNA profile. So of course we had to stay on Michael Briere, continue surveillance until he left yet another DNA sample. And eventually he did. And Al and I are stressed to the max, waiting for news. And of course we get the call from the Center of Forensic Science. And instead of giving you that news, they ask you a question.
I'll always remember that telephone call because she said, you know, in the interest of public safety, do you have around-the-clock surveillance on Michael Briere? The DNA tests are, you know, still being completed. What she told me was Center of Forensic Sciences code for, we've identified Briere as Holly's killer, but we just have, you know, a few more, you know, steps to you know, continue the analysis. But from the DNA indicators we're seeing so far, it's him.
That was probably the best phone call we ever got when we got the call back from CFS saying, you got him, it's Michael Briere. 1 in 68 million, it could be anybody else.
And we finalized the information to obtain the search warrant so that at the moment of Briere's arrest, we could move in with barricades to seal the residence off.
And our thoughts were, that's going to be the crime scene, and no matter how much efforts he had made to clean it up, we are going to find forensic evidence in there that he murdered Holly Jones in his apartment.
It's just before 8 p.m. when investigators speed away from 12 Division. Inside, hunched over, is the suspect, 35-year-old Michael Briere. Earlier in the day, barricading the street, police had Brier's home at 1450 Bloor Street West surrounded. Police arrested the man, believing he killed Holly Jones.
On June 20th, following the arrest of Michael Briere, I was instructed to contact Maria Jones and tell her we were on our way over with some news.
I knew something was up to be getting a phone call that early, actually.
This morning, lead investigator Bruce Smollett arrived at the Joneses' home to tell the family a suspect had been arrested. Shortly after, Holly's mother was seen leaving her Sterling Road home.
It was amazing, with so much relief. I couldn't wait to hear the news fast enough.
Coming up, Michael Briere's ex-wife reacts to the news, and detectives learn the horrific details of what happened to Holly. Welcome back. Police work on getting a confession out of Michael Briere, who has been charged in connection with the killing of Holly Jones. Here now is the conclusion of In Broad Daylight, the abduction of Holly Jones.
Once we got the DNA information that Michael Briere was a match, we reached out to the OPP Behavioral Sciences section, and they came immediately down to 12 Division to meet with us and help develop the strategy to get a confession, including the triggers that they thought that might work. When Dave and I visited Briere at his home, we saw a photograph of an older woman on his fridge.
I said, "Who's that beautiful woman in the picture?" And he started to tear up and he said, "That's my mom. She died and I had to go identify her, and there was a tube sticking in her mouth and blood coming out." So I started talking about Holly, and I started talking about Holly's mother, and I started talking about the fact that an added level of torture for Holly's mother is that we haven't been able to recover her legs. And I sort of said, what would your mother be telling you to do right now? Wouldn't your mother be telling you to help these officers, to give Holly Jones' mother some peace, to help us recover her legs? And at that point, he looked up. He looked up at the heavens. And I knew I had him.
And the trigger worked, and that got him to admit what he'd done.
And he finally sat up and he turned towards me and he said, "You'll never find her legs. I put them in the garbage." So I sat back and let him give me the longest, most graphic, and most detailed confession I'd ever taken in my entire career. He started out by saying, "I've always had the fantasy of having a sexual relation with a little girl." And on this particular day, he went out for a walk. And he couldn't believe it. Holly was right there. And she was walking right by the laneway. There was nobody around. So he spun around quite quickly, and he described grabbing her by the back of the neck. He grabbed her, brought her in here down this laneway, and right down between these two buildings right here. This unit here we see with the red door, that's Michael Brier's apartment in 2003. This particular door leads right to his bedroom. In her fight for her life, that poor little girl netted us the DNA sample and the evidence we needed to put her killer away. As soon as he killed her, he went into panic mode and he started searching for instruments that he could use to dismember her body so he could sneak her out of the apartment without being seen.
He had no cars. He was carrying Holly Jones' body parts on a TTC subway.
And he said at one point he was sitting across from a man and a woman, and especially the man had this horrified look on his face. And Michael looked and realized that the bag that he had sat on a seat beside him that contained Holly's torso was leaking blood. So he had moved his foot over on that droplet of blood and tried to smear it in and cover it up, if you will. And he actually said, I thought for sure I was caught at that point. So he carried on his way and he made his way down to Toronto Harbor where he threw the bag in the water. Michael Briere lived a very dark life. He had a very dark side to him that nobody knew about.
I first met Michael Briere in 1993, and my first impression was he was funny. He was charming, kind of looked like a young Dustin Hoffman, and seemed like a good guy to be around. We wanted to be together. We were inseparable. There was even talk of children at one point. And he proposed. And he said, well, let's just go to Las Vegas. We got married at the Chapel of Love. I noticed over time, and it wasn't a long time, but it was started to really show that Michael was drifting away a bit. He didn't want to go out as much anymore, and he didn't, want to do the usual things anymore, and then he wanted to start playing more video games.
His psychological makeup seemed normal. He seemed to be high functioning, became a software designer. Then it seemed at a certain point in his life, this dark side took over, became obsessed with playing video games, and then went into the dark web and started being obsessively watching child pornography.
During his confession, where he talked about the fact that child pornography is what fueled him to act out, he talked about the fact that sooner or later it didn't work for him anymore, and he felt that he now had to have sex with a child.
In June 2003, I received a call from media. So when the reporter said that my ex-husband was arrested in association to that particular heinous crime, it was like hot poison lava poured into my stomach. I think there was a lot he was hiding from me, because I don't think someone who ends up doing something like that, and this is my guess, that just happens. If I could say anything to the victim's family, it would be, I'm so sorry for your tremendous loss.
Inside the Don jail, in what's called super protective custody, it's expected that tonight will be accused child killer Michael Brier's last night as an innocent man. In court tomorrow, he's expected to plead guilty to the first-degree murder of 10-year-old Holly Jones.
I do recall going to the courtroom and promising myself I won't look at him in the face, because I didn't want to see his face, because I feared that face will never leave my head.
When Michael Briere spoke, his voice echoed through the courtroom in a bravado style when he said guilty. I was feeling anxious because I was very protective of Maria Jones at that time. She had never been told all the details of the suffering that her daughter had endured.
losing our daughter for life is one thing, but knowing the torture that she went through is such a greater pain I can't even explain.
The Jones family now plans to become activists for tougher child pornography laws and for a national sex offender registry. Breyer stood in the court today and tearfully said that he was ashamed of himself and that he deserved to be locked up for life.
I was just absolutely blown away that this reality of pornography was happening with children.
If I could give back by saving a child's life, that is a good reward for me.
I started something that we were calling Holly's Law, to maybe we can do something to help prevent this.
It's a law that basically acknowledges that there are certain offenders that can never be rehabilitated.
The law would call on the federal government to define and identify that small population of dangerous sexual predators, then bring application to have them deemed as such, which would force them to stay in prison until such a time as they were deemed rehabilitated. Now, there are some protections for prisoners. They'd be allowed a jury trial, and their cases would be reviewed on an annual basis.
Michael Breer's admissions in relation to child pornography did make a real difference. Crowns and police detectives were able to ask for stronger sentences, and along with that, it also led to mandatory sentencing and stricter sentencing guidelines.
You know, in some cases, even homicides, you celebrate a victory like that. Not in this case. There was nothing to celebrate. It was just heartbreaking sorrow, followed by a lot of people that took a long time to come to terms.
Holly's last steps are retraced every year by dozens of kids and parents clutching colorful butterflies.
Watch your fingers. When Holly was young, that she loved butterflies. So after she left, butterflies became a stronger symbol for us.
I joined Breed Families of Ontario, which I felt was very helpful for me. We would release butterflies once a year. It helped me deal with my pain a bit. I named my daughter, her middle name is Holly. I love you, miss you.
That's what we used to say to each other. It was almost every night. I love you to each and every star. Around the sun, to the moon, and back again. So, Holly, I love you. To each and every star. Around the sun, to the moon, and back again. This was the very last Mother's Day present we got. Happy Mother's Day. Love, Holly. And it says, I love you so, so much. Roses are red, violets are blue, but most of all, I love you. If I knew that Holly could hear me, I would say I'm sorry. I would say I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have let you go.
Michael Breer is eligible for day parole as of June 2025 and full parole in June 2028. While Holly's Law never came to pass, the lobbying efforts by Holly's mother and others helped in the launch of a national sex offender registry. The family continues to honor Holly's memory through public art and private keepsakes. I'm Anthony Robart. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat. Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast, now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.